Welcome to Press Review, the reaction show where we pick the stories that have grabbed us, the stories that matter from around the world. I'm Iain Martin, editor of Reaction. I'm joined by my colleague Mark Fox, who's deputy chairman of Reaction, as well as also being the man who runs the BSA, the Business Services Association. So, Mark, well, just before we start, actually, I just wanted to flag up the latest Reaction subscription offer running in October, which is that you can, of course, subscribe to Reaction on YouTube and watch these videos. You just click the button below. But if you go to our website, listed below, you'll see our latest subscription offer is for this, Andrew Roberts' fascinating new book on the life of George III, the life and reign of Britain's most misunderstood monarch. And if you become an annual subscriber to Reaction this month, we send you as a welcome gift, we send you a first edition, signed first edition of Andrew's fascinating new book. Of course, follows his big biographies of Churchill and Napoleon. So become a subscriber. So on to Press Review, Mark. The first choice is yours, is about Poland.
Well, I think what's happening in Poland is really fascinating, isn't it, Ian? Because Poland, obviously a country that spent long years under occupation, both by Germany and then by the Soviet Union, and has spent basically its entire history being sort of cut up and locked about, chopped up and pushed about as a sort of buffer country.
Yeah.
It has been going through the much more recent period of its own democratic processes, which as these processes do start with high hopes and optimism, as we've seen in South Africa as well, and then sort of take funny turns and difficult turns, and things become tricky as people don't get the results as quickly as they think they should do in terms of opportunity and economic prosperity and so on. And what we've just seen in Poland is a reassertion of the very strong Polish identity about sovereignty over European law, which directly conflicts with their obligations as members of the European Union. And of course, there's now increasing speculation around how sustainable Poland's membership of the European Union is. And we shall have to see how the EU responds to this, because it's in many ways, it's a much more serious threat to the integrity of the European Union than British membership of the EU or Brexit has ever been. Because when we were members of the EU, moan about it, as we did, no British government, no big British politician, even the most Brexity ones sitting, ever suggested we should stay as members, but simply refused to acknowledge the rules. Yeah, we said, in fact, it was one of the things, wasn't it, Ian? We said that we do stick by the rules, and we don't like the rules, and that's why we want to leave. So that was our position.
And I mean, you start to wonder, don't you, whether it was actually Britain being in the EU which kind of held it together, because everyone could regard Britain as the naughty country, which is sort of half in and half out and not fully committed. Yeah, because the story that you've highlighted, there's a link below the video. Poland defies EU as court backs government and rule of law battle, which is which is from the FT, James Shotter in Prague and Henry Foy in Brussels. And they make the point that there's a lot more than just constitutional law at stake for Poland. The EU now has to ponder how it responds. Well, it has to first wait and see precisely what the Polish government does. But if this escalates and the Polish government, as you'd expect, follows the line of its own courts, then many billions of EU money and funding, which would be expected to flow through Warsaw, are then in doubt, and you get into the question of what sort of retaliatory action there's going to be. It's actually what I wanted to highlight as my first pick is the same theme, Mark, but by a really interesting academic, Daniel Sarmiento, who's a professor of EU law based in Madrid and runs EU Law Live. And I follow him on Twitter. There's a really interesting thread about what he thinks the implication what the implications are. And he says, what will happen now? Here are some possible ways forward. He says we need to wait and see what interpretation the Polish government will make of the ruling. The ruling first has to be published in the official Gazette, and the government could halt that, but all that seems unlikely. So you could get some kind of negotiation. But if the ruling enters into force and the Polish government enforces it, then the Commission essentially moves to infringement proceedings and enforcing various measures under the articles of the EU treaties. So it is. I mean, he's saying this is a very serious situation, and that essentially it looks as though the Polish government is going to cease to apply European law. So it's not yet Polish exit. It's not Pol exit as it's being summed up. But he says, I mean, this is maybe a slightly optimistic conclusion from a pro-EU point of view. But he says, is this bad news for the EU? Well, of course it is, but it's also a sign of what the EU stands for and where the red lines are set, and that's actually good for the EU, particularly at a time in which autocratic temptations have been flirted with too frivolously. But it is a check, isn't it, to the idea, a blow to the idea of the ever expanding European Union. Do you think it over the next 10, 20 years, is there a possibility that the EU actually integrates more but becomes smaller?
No, I don't actually. I don't. I think if we take a step back, Ian, as we know, and many people watching us know, it was the explicit policy, I think, of John Major's Conservative government, wasn't it? It was expansion meant dilution of the ability to. Yes. And the truth is that, as with so many Conservative policies inside the European, like single market and so on, primacy of the rule of law and so on, is that they were very successful, right? We've been very successful, and in getting our way and what we want. And I think the truth is that the European Union, in my view, has expanded to a degree that is unsustainable. It's too big and broader thing. I don't see that further deepening, even between France and Germany, the historic axis of the whole thing. And I think the European Union is on an arc, Ian, which is it came about, I think we can all agree on this, it came about through through an idealistic thing about trying to ensure that people didn't go to war on and it's had this, you can argue in partnership with NATO or whatever, we don't need to get bogged down in that, but it's been on a trajectory and we're coming now to the point where individual countries are finding it increasingly irksome, and generations have gone that remembered and countries still feel strong and they have a sense of themselves and they want to assert themselves. And I think we see, if you've been in Poland or Hungary or these Eastern European countries, you've barely been independent before you then subscribe to another great overarching thing.
Yeah.
So I don't think it'll be smaller and deeper. I think it will be simply smaller because, as we saw recently, when push comes to shove, if they needed to unilaterally suspend Schengen or all these rules that seem so inviolate at the time, Germany, France, Italy, they all did. So, and the European Union hasn't fallen, but I suspect we've seen the apex of European size and depth.
So, interesting counterpoint to that, Mark, was the story reported by Bloomberg and by others this week, which was that because of the energy crisis, which I'm sure or potential energy crisis or shortage, which we'll get to in a moment, that 5 European governments came together this week, the French government, the Spanish government, and essentially issued a letter saying that the European energy market is broken and suggesting various ways of reform. It wasn't a particularly coherent package of reforms, but that was an appeal to Brussels. Another thing, which is also just to promote Reaction's leader subject for this weekend, which will be on the site and we'll link to as well. Strange things happening between France and the Commission at the moment, with France taking a very robust line on Britain and Brexit, and really wanting to hold Britain's feet to the fire on the Northern Ireland Protocol, etc. And Macron, in his electoral cycle, becoming more and more intemperate and using some of his ministers to criticise Britain in highly questionable way. Well, the Commission doesn't seem to be playing ball on that, and has actually, in one sense, dismissed his approach. And there are, it's understood, sort of peace talks going on, or attempts to find some kind of compromise. So there's that stress and strain as well. But that's the reaction leader. Your next choice, Mark, is about journalism, and it comes from the Daily Mail about the Nobel Peace Prize awarded to the founder of the anti-Putin newspaper Novaya Gazeta and a Filipino journalist who took on Duterte in swipe at dictators.
Well, so I thought this was one of the things that unites Fleet Street. Usually is one of the few things that unites Fleet Street is in defence of journalism and journalists' rights and so on. And sometimes people can get a bit pompous about this, but the truth is that someone who trained as a journalist and is so proud of having the connections with journalism is that journalism is really tough. Right? It's really tough to go and dig out stories. You know this, Ian, and many people who are watching this discussion through Reaction, will value good journalism and good commentary, which is why we're so grateful to everybody who subscribes and watches and participates. Yep. But it's really tough, and this age of mass information and multimedia has not meant that good, decent journalism has got any easier. In fact, in many ways, it's got much, much harder. And of course, people's ability to pump out all sorts of nonsense and rubbish and disinformation has increased exponentially as well. So I was thrilled to see, these guys who are working in the most arduous of circumstances, frankly, get really the most prestigious recognition that it's possible for people to get, and it's a real reminder that the fight for good news, for good information, frankly, whatever country you're in, is one that has to be waged every day, and that journalists make mistakes and they're held to account when they do. And in this country, we have a very sort of noisy and energetic media area. But it was nice, Ian, just to see the Daily Mail reporting great newspaper in many ways, reporting this very well-deserved accolade for these people that have really, done it the hard way. And I'm hoping that you and Reaction will get yours in due course.
Don't hold your breath, Mark Fox. You're watching Reaction Press Review, our show on YouTube, and also available on the Reaction podcast as well to listen to. It's the show where we pick the story, the editors and senior team from Reaction pick the stories which have grabbed us in the last week, which illuminate the bigger trends. My next choice is from the FT. And of course, it was Tory conference in Manchester this week, or the last week, the week in which we're recording, Mark. I wasn't there, which is highly unusual. I think I've been there pretty much every year for the last 25 years or so, and I didn't go to Labour conference either. So I watched it watched the whole thing from a distance. We'll come on to the press coverage in a moment. In terms of how Boris's speech was covered, etc. But the story that I wanted to pick, just because it's classic Robert Shrimsley and very funny Robert Shrimsley, a serious writer for the FT, but also when the mood takes him, delivers fantastic spoofs. So his piece in the FT: panic among Tories as ministries report supplies of excuses running low, which it's beautifully done. Boris Johnson has urged Tory MPs to hold their nerve as fears over supply shortages rise up the political agenda, and ministers worry that the party may run short of excuses by Christmas. How did the conference look to you, Mark? And what did you make of the coverage? Boris was very happy there, wasn't he? He looked very jolly during his speech, but a lot of the coverage was very critical, and papers like the Mail and the Telegraph were really tough on him.
Well, I think several things to say there. I mean, I'm pleased you picked out the FT, and Robert Shrimsley is a fantastic commentator, but it's also lovely stuff. It's also probably right just to mention on a sort of paper review, of course, the retirement of the great Philip Stevens, who whatever one thought necessarily of his columns from time, he's 25 years as one of the leading columnists in the country on the most important business newspaper. So that's a moment that we should mark with great reverence, actually, because it's a loss to commentary. There's no question about it. Although I reviewed his recent book slightly harshly, a bit toughly for reaction, it's nevertheless
harsh but fair.
Yeah, but worth reading, very much worth reading. So Robert's great, but of course it's also, I think it's worth saying, the FT has become, one of the really reliable sources of good written news. George Parker and his team, they're very, very good. The conference, Iain, I would say, over the time, I think I've been attending them since I was 16, right? And I'm now 51. And they've changed. They've completely changed from all recognition. So Boris's conference this year, pandemic or no, was a further evolution. They've changed from being a gathering of what you might think of as a family gathering. Labour's conferences are always ones, they're great rallies, the great issues are debated and rowed about. At their best, they're hugely lively, dynamic things. Conservative conferences have tended to be gatherings of like-minded people over a long weekend. Now, increasingly, they're gatherings of either the old and the bold or the young and don't understand and the highly inexperienced, And
they're corporate gatherings as well, aren't they?
They are massive corporate gatherings. I never quite understand why corporate Britain goes to party conferences, because politicians of all stripes will happily drink your booze and take your money and not remember a word of what you said after. So I personally, I think it's a complete waste of time and money for business to go. But if that's their thing, that's what helps keep the whole show on the road and the whole thing afloat. And I thought that, one of the reasons conferences are becoming less significant in reality is that speeches are shorter, the coverage is smaller, the people attending was very sparse in the hall. If you look, it used to be when I worked for a cabinet minister or for William Hague when he was a leader, you would think of announcements to make. It would be a huge thing. You'd square it away with your colleagues in the Treasury team or whichever department it is that you're making a decision about. You do all of that. But nobody made a policy announcement this week. If they did it, they can certainly do it again because nobody noticed. And the Prime Minister didn't even attempt to do it. And I think that the Prime Minister did is the absolute necessary endpoint of where these things get to. The Prime Minister delivered, now I'm going to cause trouble, bit of controversy here with you, Iain, right? The Prime Minister delivered what I thought was, at its heart, a very serious speech. But he did what he usually does, which was to dress it all up in fantastic one-liners, and he referred to the Italian economist, didn't he, whose name is Vilfredo Pareto, which I have gone out and bought on Boris's recommendation, right? And Boris skated over it, but there is at the heart of all this Borisism, Boris policy, he revealed for the first time that there is some sort of intellectual basis for it. Now, to me, it's very innovative. Let me put it like that, right? Squeezing the labour supply.
That's politely put, yeah.
Right. So, but nevertheless, there is, and that's the first time we've ever heard Boris give an intellectual basis for boosterism, for this policy, which much more than levelling up is the cornerstone of Boris's leitmotif of Boris's premiership.
Yeah, that's
so true. I thought it was very revealing. I thought it was properly revealing. And nobody really has written about that because it was all the usual, which is his favourite technique. Do a serious thing here, but draw everybody's attention over there.
But I'm going to disagree with you, Mark. I mean, I wrote for the Times this week on the speech, and I got an intriguing response from various Tory MPs I saw yesterday. Some who thought it was too harsh on the Prime Minister, and others who thought it was not harsh enough. They're so concerned about what's really going on in the economy and the global situation. I thought it was fundamentally unserious. And I mean, I think there was one serious point in it, which was buried a bit, which was he called Keir Starmer the chameleon, but it's actually Boris who's the shapeshifter. He's a phenomenal politician. He's a centrist politician, praising the NHS, increasing public spending, while also managing to convince parts of his party, or maybe less convinced than they were, that because he's a vote winner, he's maybe more right-wing, that he's really more right-wing than his public rhetoric suggests. So it was the act of the supreme politician in his pomp. But I thought it was at a moment of where the international situation is so precarious and the energy situation is so troubling, and strange things are happening to the money supply and to the British economy, happening elsewhere as well. But Britain may end up being clobbered particularly hard this winter. I just thought it lacked moral depth, to be honest, which would make Boris himself laugh. The idea that a speech like that should have moral depth. But I really longed for, particularly on the question of foreign affairs and the question of what's happening with China and Taiwan and the big geopolitical shifts, it needed a 10 or 15 minute section of the kind that Tony Blair or Margaret Thatcher or Gordon Brown or David Cameron, to be fair to him, would have earmarked. And that would have been a section with no jokes, in which the leader of the largest party, leader of the government, essentially levels with people and explains to them the difficulties that might lie ahead. I think that that's a duty of national leadership. Even the bit where he got to AUKUS, and it was reported, various newspapers, the Telegraph, for example, did the best Boris one-liners. There were so many good one-liners in it. It was a very funny speech in that sense. But even the business on AUKUS, which I think is something of real long-lasting importance and very serious, even that was turned into a one-liner. So I just thought it was. I described it in the Times as it being like a man standing at the bar, the first-class bar in the Titanic, ordering a round of drinks and regaling people with funny stories just as it's about to become apparent that there are insufficient lifeboats. A reader did get in touch to say, well, there was something missing from that Boris was probably putting the drinks he was ordering on someone else's tab, but maybe that's a step too far. But so we disagree on that one.
And I was just going to tease you slightly, because I know you don't.
I shouldn't have. Well, I shouldn't. Firstly, I shouldn't have quoted from my own column, but
no, because I was going to say, it was a very good column, and people should read it because it's an important column. But I'm going to tease you, Mr. Editor. I think you're being a bit stuffy, because I think, look, we know Boris. We have known Boris better than anybody who's become Prime Minister in our lifetime. We know more about him personally and politically. And he's been a big figure in journalists. We know him. We know Boris. We know exactly what Boris does and what Boris is not going to do. And so I think that's worth remembering, that he delivered what we thought he would deliver. The second thing is about it is probably also fair to say that he's just appointed a new chief of the defence staff. Mm-hmm. We've got the budget coming up. So we've got the spending review coming up. We've got a lot of big things coming in the next week or two, haven't we?
We have,
which would be quite difficult to preempt. I'm not saying he couldn't have done, but his appointment of Admiral Sir Tony Radakin as the chief of defence is quite a clear statement about where he wants defence to go. For example,
yeah,
right. I mean, I think if I was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I would be having sleepless nights. No question about it.
Yeah, yes. And so your next story, actually, which I'm just getting to, was from the Times, which is precisely what you just mentioned there, which is Royal Navy Admiral Tony Radakin named as next head of the armed forces, which is a very big deal. So there's been a lot of manoeuvring. Takes over from General Sinead Carter, who's retiring at 62, steps down at the end of November. So all changed. That's a big shift, isn't it? With the first Sea Lord, is the first military chief to come from the Navy since I think Michael Boyce. Is that too? Yeah,
since Mike Boyce 20 years ago, yes. And it's a big shift in two ways. First of all, I think it's a very personal appointment. The Prime Minister took this appointment very much into number 10. drove the process, interviewed the candidates personally, very hands-on in the process. And, you know, he's made really big speeches, right? I mean, we want proper serious speeches from Boris. At least 2 of them since he's been Prime Minister have been about his maritime shift, his maritime tilt. And really the appointment of Tony Radakin seals that deliberate and decisive shift that the Prime Minister is driving in the nature of defence. The second thing is that Tony Radakin is what you might think of as the first post-Afghanistan senior military leader.
Yeah.
Right. So Nick Carter and all of those guys have been very preoccupied with coming out of Afghanistan and what it's all meant, what it's all been about, and what the legacy of it all is and isn't, and so on. That really Tony Radakin is that next, in the same way as the Prime Minister had absolutely nothing to do with going into Afghanistan, or really much to do with it for the vast majority of things. So really they do represent, the Prime Minister and Tony Radakin, the new CDS, the first post-Afghanistan generation of political and military leaders, which I think is important because we've been in this thing around Afghanistan for good reason for a long time, but somehow we've got to move forward, and which will be difficult, and it will have a long tail, that whole engagement.
And I think you just had one other story that you wanted to highlight from the Oldie.
I did, because I love the Oldie. Right, it's just the most fantastic. Second only to Reaction. The Oldie is brilliant, and there's a wonderful piece in it by Martin Vander Veyer, who's written a piece how bankers lost credit. Ex-banker charts the decline of money men from cultivated intellectuals to today's greedy buccaneers. And it's a wonderful read, 1-page read. And it's based on his new book, The Good, the Bad, and the Greedy. I don't know him, as you can imagine. I don't know how to say his name, so I'm not here as his press agent. But I tell you, if the book is as good as his piece, then I think it's well worth buying. But it was, again, you know, bankers and banking has never recovered from that shock. And it's really interesting because it's all part of, isn't it, Ian, that we saw at the Conservative Party conference, how Conservative politicians can increasingly get across and confront different business sectors with the support of the public, of which banking and bankers, as well as the energy companies and so on, are part of that piece. Big shift.
I think I think the situation is really potentially very dangerous, and the Prime Minister is attempting to defy economics. May get away with it. Actually, it may be that this is a mild winter. The energy supply shock is not as severe as people imagine, that Chinese production gets going again, that output endures, and inflation is temporary. It turns out to be temporary. I don't believe that is. Already you can see the bank that only a few weeks ago was saying that inflation was temporary or transient is now saying it's slightly less less transient or less temporary than they'd thought. So I think there's a difficult period right ahead. But on that note, I think we're going to wrap up this edition of Press Review with me, Iain Martin, editor of Reaction. I was joined by my colleague, Deputy Chairman of Reaction, Mark Fox. Thank you, Mark. Also, just mention again, just before we go, Andrew Roberts, George III, The Life and Reign of Britain's Most Misunderstood
Very good
Monarch.
book.
It's,
And my relative,
I got a copy 3 weeks ago from the publisher, and it is outstanding. He's done it again after that Life of Napoleon and the Life of Churchill. It was so successful. I think it's deserves to be a big hit. But it also, I should say, Mark, is our book of the month on Reaction. And if you become a Reaction subscriber, become an annual member of Reaction, then the link, please follow the link below. Then we send you, as a welcome gift, we send you during October a copy of Andrew Roberts' new book. And on that note, Mark, I think we're going to wrap up Press Review. But until next time, thank you for watching and listening.